Throwables in Helldivers 2 can be a critical aspect of your arsenal. These can offer a variety of explosive capabilities or can dish out some other sort of special ability. And a properly placed grenade can make all the difference for you on the battlefield. And so these should definitely not be forgotten. Not all throwables, though, are created equal. And so that begs the question, which of these are the best and which are the worst? Dr. Pooplove here, and that's what I'd like to find out. In this video, I will rank each of the throwables in Helldivers 2 on a tier list, with S being the best and Poop Hater being the worst. But not just one tier list, 3 tier lists, because the effectiveness of these throwables will wildly vary depending on whether you are facing off against the Terminids, the Automatons, or the Illuminate. Starting with the G12 High Explosive Grenade, which is the throwable you start the game with. It's a high damaging explosive with heavy armor penetration and a decently long fuse time. And versus the bugs, I do think this leaves quite a bit to be desired. The explosions do, of course, do a lot of damage, but the fuse time being so long can make it a little bit tough to time your throws in order to hit your targets appropriately. Of course, you can cook your grenade by holding onto it for a little while, allowing for that fuse time to be a little bit shorter. But doing so reduces your mobility, making you slower, and so that can be tough when you are in dicier situations. Another thing you can do is, while running away, drop this at your feet and keep running so that the explosion goes off on the enemies chasing you. That can be a great way to get some of the enemies off your back, although the slightly longer fuse time can sometimes make it hard to get those closest to you. One great thing about this is this will close bug holes well, and this is something where the fuse will come more in handy, as it allows for some time for the bomb to actually settle into the hole with less potential for it to be wasted. Now, another thing to note about this one is it is heavy armor penetrating, so it does have the capability to go against some of the biggest enemies in the game, although in most cases not the most efficiently. I will say though that this is actually pretty good for the chargers, especially when they are in that mode crawling towards you, because it gives you a little bit of time to cook this and throw this under them in order to take them out pretty nicely. This is a tough one for me. I think this has some pros and cons. I think if you really get used to the timing, you can make good work of this, but it's not going to be the strongest one of these options for you. I'll give it a low B for the bugs. Now, for the bots, I can find some better uses here. The longer fuse time makes this perhaps one of the best throwables for the fabricators, as you don't need to worry about trying to perfectly arc your shots into those holes, like you would with something like the Impact throwable. The high penetration and high damage also makes this a pretty decent option for the tanks, especially since they move slowly. And actually, a lot of enemies on this front tend to move a little bit slower, so having that longer fuse time is a little bit less of an issue on this front. That being said, it can still be pretty hard to time things, so just be aware of that. Another good thing is dropping this at your feet when the berserkers are close can be a good way to get them. Ultimately, I like this a little bit more, but it's not the top. I think it gets a B for the bots. And for the squids, this has a little bit going for it. This can deal with the spaceships pretty well, and throwing it at the floor while running away can help if the horde is on your heels. Cooking this as well can be used decently here versus them, but it's still pretty hard to time it correctly versus a lot of the flying targets and the harvesters. I think ultimately there are a lot better throwables that are just going to be a little bit more useful on this front, so I don't think it's that great. I'll give it a C for the squids. Now next is a fairly similar throwable, the G6 Frag, which does less damage and has a lower armor penetration than the high explosive for the trade-off of a bigger explosive radius and a shorter fuse time. And for the bugs, I think these trade-offs make this a little bit of a better option for you, mostly because the bigger explosive radius can deal with more of the horde, and the lower fuse time means you can time things a little bit easier. You can also cook these for an even smaller fuse time, which is nice, and dropping these at your feet, of course, can get at the enemies that are a little bit closer to you. This also is pretty great for the bug holes, but all that being said, it's definitely not the strongest option, so I will give it a B for the bugs. Now for the bots, while still fairly close to the high explosive, I like this less. The lower armor penetration means this is going to be less effective versus some of the heavier armored enemies, and because the enemies travel a little bit less in a horde type type fashion, it means the wider splash damage comes less in handy. The shorter fuse time is probably the better aspect of this, but again, because enemies move a little bit slower on this front, it's not really enough of an advantage. And I'm not the hugest fan of this. I will give it a C for the bots. And for the squids, I feel pretty similar to how I feel as versus the bugs. The wider explosion makes this better for the voteless horde than the high explosive. And having much less heavily armored targets on this front means the lower armor penetration here is not much of an issue. This also works for the spaceships being thrown into the holes, but there is a serious problem with this in my mind. What hurts this a lot is versus the Tesla towers, which it really does struggle a lot with, because that is one of the main things you like to have your throwable for, is for some of these utility options, and just struggling against this is very bad, and actually in my mind reduces this from what would otherwise be a B to a C for the squids. But now the next thing is another explosive throwable, and that is the TED 63 Dynamite, which releases a high damage and widespread explosion after a variable timer, which can be set to either 5 seconds, 15 seconds, or a minute, which we'll talk about that. And versus the bugs, this does have some potential. The bigger explosive radius coupled with the high damage means that this can get a good chunk of the horde. And this can be used for some of the normal bug holes. And I initially did think that this actually did close the big Bile Titan bug holes, but in looking back at the footage, it seems that what actually closed this was the Bile Titan. So no, it's not going to be able to do that. Now I do wish this had a sticky effect like the Thermite grenade, so that maybe you could have it explode on targets, and maybe that would make good use of some of the longer timer durations, but it does not do that. Now, speaking of the timer durations, I really don't see a huge point in delaying the fuse past the 5-second mark. Really, that is enough time in order to get out of the way of an explosion, and maybe 15 seconds could be nice, but especially the 60-second timer, it doesn't seem that useful. Some have pointed out that that minute timer could be good for stealth, allowing you to sneak around and create either distractions or blow up things long after you're gone, and I can kind of get that argument, but 60 seconds still feels kind of like a long time, and I honestly just wish you could trigger the explosion whenever you're ready, maybe by putting in some stratagem input. All in all though, this is still okay, especially if left on that 5-second timer. I will give it a B for the bugs. Now for the bots, I just really don't like this. The widespread explosion here can get to a bunch, but it really doesn't feel that useful. I also thought maybe this could take out a fabricator from the outside, but only by throwing it on its holes. The longer timer does feel like it could be a good thing for the convoys, like laying a trap for them to arrive, and timing it could be an effective thing, but it's just not strong enough. I do think I was initially maybe a little bit harsh on this, giving it a poop hater category, as it does kind of operate somewhat similarly to the Frag grenade. It's definitely not the best, but it's definitely not the absolute worst. I will give it a C for the bots. And for the squids, this can be okay, especially with the widespread explosion, allowing it to be pretty effective for the horde. And it can also destroy the spaceship, so that is good. And the other thing is, this one can successfully take down the enemy Tesla towers, which does differentiate this from the Frag. And as long as you're okay with a little bit of a longer fuse time, I think makes it a preferable option. So I will give it a B for the squids. But the next one we have is pretty hot. That's the G10 Incendiary, which is a grenade that when it explodes, it engulfs an area in flames after its fuse time. And versus the bugs, this feels pretty good. Bugs are particularly weak to the flames, and so this will burn them pretty nicely. But this will also leave the flames on the ground for a while, such that anything walking over it can get that damage over time impact. You do need to get used to the fuse timer here, but it's pretty nice to have because you can drop this at your feet and run away, leading the enemies basically into your trap. Now, this isn't going to be great for the bigger enemies, but it will handle a lot of the smaller ones nicely, and it can also close bug holes. So for all that, I will give it an A for the bugs. Now, for the bots, this is pretty bad. Flames aren't super effective versus these robotic menaces, and so you don't really find this having too tremendous of an impact. This will close the fabricators, and it can be decent for the berserkers walkers that are chasing you, but it struggles versus a lot of the enemies. And because a lot of the damage is this damage over time effect versus an explosion that can instantly dish out that damage, it makes this much slower to have that impact and can leave the chaos lingering quite a bit longer. I am really not a fan of using this on this front. I'm going to give it a poop hater versus the bots. But for the squids, I think this is quite amazing. The voteless are very weak to the flames, and if you light up the ground, this can be a very easy way to lead them into your trap. I like dropping this at my feet, running away, and watching the numbers just rack up behind me. Also, this is capable of taking down a spaceship once the shields are down. I think especially if you don't have one of the flamethrowers on any of your weapon slots, this can be a great item to have to just rack up big numbers of kills. I think this is really good on this front. I'm going to give it an S tier for the squids. Now, the next one is the G16 Impact, which is essentially a variant of the high explosive, but it does half the damage for the trade-off of absolutely no fuse time. This will explode the moment it hits something. And versus the bugs, I quite like this trade-off. Being able to hit things as soon as it impacts them means I can get on target more precisely, and having no fuse time at all means I don't have to wait. Against the Horde, I like how this can get a good clump of them pretty nicely, and this is actually very satisfying to use versus the bile spewers, getting them as soon as you make contact. With this thing having heavy armor penetration, it can also even go for some of the big guys, although going for the weak spots is still going to be your best bet. Of course, this does have some downsides. The impact nature of this means it can be harder to close the bug holes, and so you do need to be a little bit more accurate while aiming this thing. There also is a big risk using this on anything that comes close to you, although I have found that diving backwards and throwing tends to minimize that risk. The other thing here is the lower damage means it can make you need to use a little bit more of these. All that being said, I still find this a super solid option, and being able to do it right on impact just feels so much better. I'm going to give it an A for the bugs. Now, for the bots, I really like this as well. The heavy armor penetration means that this can get the tanks usually in about 2 shots and instantly as soon as you impact them. This can also even take out a Hulk, although it will take a while for the Hulks. I really like this for the Striders because if you aim it at their legs, you can knock them out in 1 shot. And generally this also does do a decent deal of damage versus a clump of enemies. What hurts this really is versus the Fabricators, where it can be really hard to get them into the holes, and so you could end up wasting some of these trying. But once you get kind of the hang of it, just trying to end up getting it more towards the back of the hole, you can tend to get this a little bit more consistently. I still really love this. The impact nature just makes it feel so good. I will give it an A for the bots. And for the squids, I love this as well. This takes out a big clump of the Horde nicely, and you can get them instantly so you don't have to wait. This can also be somewhat decent for the Overseers, but it will take a few. And you can at least use these to stagger the Harvesters, although it's not going to be that effective. Versus the spaceships with their shields down, this doesn't suffer as much as it might on the other fronts, as the holes that you throw these into are really big, and so it's really hard to make a mistake here. I also like that this does enough damage to knock out the enemy Tesla towers in 1 go. I find this to be the epitome of a great throwable on this front, but not quite as good as some of the upcoming ones, so I'll give it an A for the squids. But what would happen if the impact grenade and the incendiary had a baby? You would have the G13 Incendiary Impact, which is an impact version of the G10 Incendiary, doing half the damage, but engulfing an area in flames right upon impact. And versus the bugs, this can be pretty useful. Bugs, as I said, are weak to the flames, but this will also apply that damage over time effect to them with a decently big splash upon impact. And lighting the ground on fire, which can impact anything that walks over it. As the bugs do like to get close though, you just need to be very careful as there is no fuse time here, and so you can end up getting caught up in the flames. While this can feel impactful, the damage on this thing does feel quite a bit low, especially compared to the normal incendiary grenade, which makes you want to use more of these against the bugs. As such, I don't feel like this is impactful enough on this front and doesn't feel like a proper substitute for something like the torture, or the crisper. This can close bug holes though, and it can also be nice for throwing on the bug breaches and getting littler bugs to nice effect. This is decent, just not as strong as I would like, and noticeably weaker than the regular version with just that fuse time trade-off. I will give it a B for the bugs. Now for the bots, I just straight up do not like this. Flames, as I said on this front, do not have much impact, even versus the Flame Brigade, which are happy to be able to easily light you up. The main problem is the lower damage on this, which even with that damage over time effect feels pretty slow and even wears off before killing some of the enemies. As a result, this really just doesn't feel great. Sure, it can close fabricators, but the impact nature of this makes it even harder. I really don't like this. This is really bad poop hater category for the bots. But for the squids, this does perform a bit better. The Voteless Horde are really weak to the flame, and this can hurt them, although just like the bugs, the damage on this feels weaker than the normal incendiary. Where when you have something like the crisper or the torture, where lighting up just a little bit of the ground can wipe out a whole swarm of these guys, this not really being able to have that same impact can be quite disappointing. This can destroy the spaceships, but that's not really good enough. I will give it a B for the squids. But the next throwable that we have might stun you. The G23 Stun, which is a grenade that does not do damage, but when it explodes after a short fuse time, it stuns everything in its radius. And for the bugs, this can be pretty good, especially with a lot of enemies that will charge at you, like the Chargers and the Commanders. You can stop these guys dead in their tracks and allow you to have your way with them. Or you can use this versus a clump of the Horde, just completely freezing them so you can escape or follow up with something to finish them off. The main downside is this just is one of the few throwables that cannot close bug holes, and because this doesn't do damage, you do need to make sure that you have something else ready to follow up. It also doesn't work for the Bile Titan, and it would be kind of nice if it did. It's still very great though, it's just not my favorite. I will give it an A for the bugs. Now for the bots, I think this is quite a bit better, mostly because this can just shut down and freeze a lot of the most dangerous enemies that can cause a lot of chaos on the battlefield, such as the rocket devastators. This also is amazing versus the hulks, either allowing you to freeze them so you can more easily take them from the front, or allowing you to run around the back and get them from their heatsink. And one thing about the stun grenades is you can often find yourself getting caught in the stun radius, and that can be a little bit annoying, but one way to actually avoid this is to time a dive for once this thing explodes. This will negate any of the effects that could happen to you and allow you to move on. This serves as a pretty great all-around backup on this front, and especially with all the chaos that a lot of these enemies create, being able to freeze these guys for a little bit of time can allow you to breathe and can allow you to survive. Sure, it's not going to close a fabricator, but given that you will probably want to have a lot of heavily damage explosive type things on your loadout on this front anyways, you probably won't need it to. I think this is one of the best things you can have on this front. I'm going to give it an S tier for the bots. Now for the squids, I am just much less of a fan of this thing. The main benefit is its ability to freeze a big group of the voteless, including overseers in that group, and you can also use it versus some of the flying enemies if you cook this correctly. But the other thing is, because this is not going to do any damage for you, you do have to follow up with something else, and I don't find it to be super impactful on this front, and there are better options. I think I will give it a B for the squids. The next throwable is going to smell a little bit funny, and that is the G4 gas. And this is a grenade that releases a caustic gas cloud after a short fuse. And versus the bugs, I absolutely love this. While the explosion itself is not going to cause a lot of immediate damage, anything caught in the cloud will become confused, distracted, and take damage over time. This means that anything caught in the radius will take significant damage, as well as just lay off you for a period of time. And this will kill off some enemies on its own, or allow you to just finish off some of the higher health enemies who have become significantly weaker. But to put the cherry on top here, this can also be used to close the bug holes, making this very effective and very useful, and really just one of the top bug grenades for you. To me, this is definitely an S tier for the bugs. Now for the bots, I like this too, but I am a little bit less of a fan. The gas cloud here can confuse the enemies, but since they don't really clump up as much and tend to be at further ranges, it can be harder to make good, effective use of this. I do like this though as a slight alternative to the stun bomb for the Hulks, because you can confuse them and this can allow you a chance to run around and get them from the back. Or if you do need to escape from a hectic situation, this can be pretty useful in confusing a group of enemies, giving you a chance to run by. This also can be used to close fabricators, which is a nice plus. All in all, it's solid. I just don't find this to be at the top. I will give it an A for the bots. And for the squids, I actually think this is amazing. This will have you just completely racking up numbers versus especially the Volus Horde, as the damage will tend to kill them off. And this is also just amazing for getting everyone off your back because they're confused and they end up running in all sorts of directions. This can also be good for the ground overseers as well, confusing them for a good time and weakening them so you can finish them off. Now another plus is this can also deal with the spaceships by throwing one of these into the hull, and it can also destroy the enemy Tesla towers as well. This feels amazing and is one of the top picks versus the squids. This is going to get an S tier from me. But the next throwable we have will require you to aim a lot less. We have the G50 Seeker, which is essentially a variant of the impact grenade, only it flies around and auto locks onto targets, seeking them out and exploding once impacted. You can either mark targets with this so that you can tell the Seeker what to prioritize, or you can just allow it to randomly seek something relatively close. And if nothing is close, it will hover around you until it finds something. Now for the bugs, although this sounds pretty great, I'm not the biggest fan of this. The damage on this is on the lower side at 400, and so it's not going to do a ton of work versus the bigger guys who you may be inclined to mark and have this thing try to prioritize. And unfortunately, this does not try to seek out weak spots on any of the marked targets, which would be a nice touch. Now, when you don't mark targets, this can also feel pretty random who it's going to go for. And oftentimes it doesn't really go for your most immediate threat. Other times it will go for your most immediate threat, but after taking some time to seek it out, that threat will be in your face. And so you will get caught up in the explosion. This also won't close bug holes, even if you do mark them, which would really make this really nice. I think this is generally going to be best for going for medium targets like the spewers, commanders, or stalkers. Generally, I just don't find the benefits of the auto targeting all that useful on this front. I think I'd rather have a little bit more control over where and when this is going to hit things, and I definitely don't prefer this over the normal impact grenade where you do have a lot more of that control. I'm going to give it a C for the bugs. Now for the bots, I think this can be a little bit more effective, mostly because you are facing some of these enemies at range. It can be harder to hit farther away targets with a normal throwable. So being able to auto lock onto things like Striders and Devastators can make this pretty useful. Now this will struggle versus some of the bigger enemies like the Hulks, and I wouldn't even bother going for the Factory Striders, as again, it doesn't go specifically for the weak spots. And it also struggles versus even the tanks and cannons, as for all of these bigger type of enemies, it doesn't auto target the weak spots like the heat sinks. You can kind of get it to hit those spots, but you have to be a little bit more strategic. You kind of need to be aiming for those spots and have a good angle on them for it to go for them just naturally, because that's the closest part. Now, also the thing is, the range on this thing can be a bit frustrating. While it often will go for closer targets that you've marked, it can sometimes take a while to come back and boomerang around to them. And that's not too bad, but the farther away targets, sometimes it just completely doesn't seem to register and it will go for someone completely different. And unfortunately, no, this also will not target the fabricator vents, which would be a nice way to take them out easily. What saves this quite a bit in my eyes is versus the gunships, because if you mark this, two of these can lock on and take them out nicely without making you look up to the sky or give it much of a second thought. I do kind of wish it was only one of these to take a gunship out, but either way, it's pretty convenient. And while it definitely has a lot of bad things going for it, I can see a really good justification of taking taking it out on this front being something to deal with the gunships as well as some of the medium guys that are at that medium level of range. So I'm actually going to give it an A for the bots. Now for the squids, this has some good and some bad. This can blow a good chunk of the horde for you, and sometimes you can even see some crazy numbers rack up, although I have heard that that's a glitch and not always an accurate count. This also does go for the overseers and the watchers, but it will take about 2 of these, and that feels like it's a bit too much. I do like this a little bit for the harvesters, as it will seek them out and stagger them and even go through their shields, but you do still have to be pretty careful with the range. It's not going to be a super effective way to kill them, but you can just be a nice way to throw these guys off and stop their attack. Unfortunately, this also won't go for the spaceships when their shields are down, even if you mark it and try your best to even lead it into it, and that can be frustrating. And another bad thing here is this one, just like the Frag, really struggles against the enemy Tesla towers, and that's really bad. Generally, it has some good uses, but it's not that amazing, and I don't find it to be super impactful. I'm going to give it a C for the squids. But the next one is a very interesting one that I don't see people using at all. The G3 smoke. And this does not do any damage, but instead releases a big smoke cloud, obscuring the enemy from being able to detect you. And now versus the bugs, this might feel like an easy poop hater tier, but I do think this can be slightly underrated. While this does no damage and can't close bug holes, I do think it has some use cases, mostly if you like to play it stealthy. You can use this to block lines of sight to where you are traversing, as well as obscure an objective so that enemies don't know you are there, and I think that can be slightly effective. I think the best use case really is using this in order to help you escape from a horde. Now, while this does have some uses here, I still have a lot of problems with it. In many cases, it does feel like it's not really obscuring the enemy vision enough, and even in some cases, throwing this can alert the enemies to where you are, completely taking you out of stealth. I've also found that often if an enemy spots you and is heading towards you and you smoke in front of them in order to get away, they will still continue their trajectory towards you and eventually come through that smoke and spot you again. It may be too much to add some confusion like the gas does, or take enemies completely out of alert, but I do not find that this is working as much for me as I would like. I think one of the best ways you can use this is with the jump pack, because you can smoke and jump away, and that can give you enough distance to go back into stealth, but it's hard to know how much smoke is working for you versus just the jump pack and the distance. Now, I'll admit I do kind of suck at stealth, so I may not be the best judge here, but I also just wish this really worked more for me and actually helped me be better at stealth, and I just don't find that to be the case. I think it's a little bit underrated, but not too much. I will give it a C for the bugs. Now, for the bots, I think this can be a little bit more useful, mostly because as you face these guys at range, the smoke can be used to make it harder for enemies with guns in order to hit you, obscuring their ability to aim. And when you do get into a dicey situation, this can feel like it can help you escape. Now, that said, I don't feel like it obscures enemies enough, and they do still seem to be able to easily spot me if we are both in the same smoke cloud, and I find that to be a little bit disappointing. Generally, this feels like a big sacrifice to put on your loadout, but I can give it some points just in that I think it can help you with stealth. I will give it a B for the bots. And for the squids, I find this to be a bit of a struggle as well. I even tried to use this while escaping and hiding with the scout perk, and the vote list still basically found me instantly, which feels like it's not really making any impact at all. That said, I did find a little bit of use being able to confuse enemies and being able to walk right by these overseers while staying undetected, as well as using it to stay in stealth versus the watchers, which can allow you to get past the defenses, so I'll give it a few points for that. That said, it's not a lot of points, and it really just narrowly avoids the poop hater category. I will give it a C for the squids. But the next one is a very interesting one that is going to make a huge difference for you on the battlefield, the G123 Thermite. And this is an anti-tank grenade that actually sticks to targets and over time performs a ton of damage to the enemy. For the bugs, this is really one of my favorite throwables to have equipped, mostly because of what this does to the chargers. If you stick just one Thermite to these guys, they will die, making them essentially a non-issue for you. All you have to do is really just wait for the whole explosion process to occur. Now, this alone, in my opinion, makes it worth it to take out, but this also is good for things like the Impaler, being able to take them out in one go, as well as being able to close bug holes if you really need to. And while not the most efficient use of this, it will take about 3 of these, and you can use it for a Bile Titan if necessary. Now, for anything lower than a charger, it can be useful, but it will kind of feel like a waste most of the time. Although you can leave one of these around a bunch of enemies and will take some of these guys out. So it will have some usefulness if necessary. Mostly though, it just amazes me in what it's able to do in just deleting chargers from the game for me, making them so much less threatening and just really helping manage a lot of chaos on the battlefield. I quite love this, and I think this is definitely an S tier for the bugs. And for the bots, I have very similar feelings, and arguably this is perhaps even better. This can be a dedicated Hulk killer, which is amazing, being able to take them out with just one of these, but it's also going to be useful for the tanks as well, which can be very nice. It also doesn't really feel like a huge waste when used against some of the medium guys like the Striders, and it looks like it's about 3 for a factory Strider as well. I also love this for the fabricators because sure, you can throw this into the holes, but actually you can just throw it and have it attach on the outside of the fabricator and it will take them out in one go, and that can be very useful. I find this to be pretty amazing. I will give it an S tier for the bots. Now for the squids, I think this loses some of its wow factor. Unlike some of the other anti-tank weapons, this will not pierce the spaceship shields, and so you will have to take those down in order to use this to take those out. This will take out a harvester with one throw, although in some cases you're probably going to end up needing to use 2. And that's still great, but you will need to get close in order to achieve this, and I just think you're better off with many more different things in order to take these guys out, especially trying to do so at range is going to be a little bit more effective. Now, this will take out an Overseer, and if left on the ground, it can take some of the nearby Voteless out, but that just feels a little bit like overkill, and right now, this just doesn't have enough good going for it. Doesn't feel like a really good choice and something that's going to be super effective for you. I'm going to give it a C for the squids. But now for one of the least explosive throwables we have, and that is the K2 throwing knife, which is a medium armor penetrating knife with a lot of inventory that can be thrown at enemies and is meant to be more of a silent option for taking them out stealthily. Now, whether that is actually true though is another story. Versus the bugs, this thing is rough. First of all, the crosshair or the arc or something on this just doesn't feel aligned, and it just often does not hit what you were trying to go for. I think there may be an issue here with the way this is set up, and so that already is a problem. The other thing here is, well, it's just not very stealthy, especially if you end up missing your shot. It seems like the enemies know exactly where you are, even if you are in stealth. Now, what this does have is that if you can manage to hit your target, it will do a good deal of damage, and it can even stagger the enemies back. But since this doesn't really work that well, there really is not much to redeem this. I think this would be a better option if it was either comically strong or if it could actually be stealthy and accurate, and I would love it if you could pick your knife off of dead targets. This is stylish though, and while I won't give it any points for that, I never get tired of seeing that knife animation. This is though poop hater tier for the bugs. And for the bots, it's pretty much the same thing. The crosshair misalignment here makes it near impossible to get on target correctly, and this is just not very stealthy feeling, as one shot here immediately alerted everyone to know exactly where I am. Now, if you can stealth and you can nail your targets in one shot, this does seem to work for you. But again, with the crosshair misaligned, this is just not pretty. I wish it was good, but it's not. It sucks. It's poop hater tier. And versus the squids, yeah, it's kind of the same thing. Although one really cool thing I've discovered is that this can one-shot headshot an Overseer. So if for some reason you are able to get used to the way this crosshair is and how to aim this, you could potentially use this as a dedicated Overseer killer that can probably keep you in stealth. Still though, I can't hit a target with this thing, and I think they just need to fix that. I can't give this a good rating just because of how broken it feels. I'm going to give this a poop hater category. And so here we have our lists. This is how the throwables rank versus the bugs. Here is how they rank versus the bots. And here is how they rank versus the squids. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and check out my playlist for more Helldivers tier lists. Thank you to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement. Consider joining yourself if you want to be enshrined in the Hall of Poop. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.